Previously on Fighting for Ezekiel.
And I just remember Colette giving me a phone call and just saying, we've got a sick boy here.
And I remember that we had talked about things that I did with my kids when they had croup.
So I hadn't seen him for about a 2.5 day period from Wednesday till Friday. And he was substantially better by that point.
And I was there the night before Ezekiel died. And I saw nothing that alarmed me at all.
In a short period of time, it went from being just something of interest, like, is this something that we need to act on? Like, everything else is fine, to now he's not breathing.
So that just came on that suddenly?
It came on pretty quick.
911 emergency, do you fire police, fire ambulance?
Hi, yes, my son's not breathing.
By Thursday, they were diagnosing Ezekiel with having brain death.
And now, part 2 of Fighting for Ezekiel, a Bridge City News exclusive.
Today in part 2, we are going to hear details of charges being laid, the media response, and discussion about parental rights. David and Collet Stephan are parents, just like most of us, loving their children and sometimes faced with having to make tough decisions on the health of their child. We have all had to decide whether or not our child is sick enough to take to emergency, or just to wait it out. Not many of us would likely think that our decision would ever end up with criminal charges being laid.
You went through a very difficult period here then, of course, with life support being disconnected and your son dying. Funeral plans, all these things, practically speaking, had to take place. Time of mourning. And at what point were you actually informed of charges being laid in the middle of all of that?
It was nearly a year later. So what happened is we wanted closure because we were really confused about what led to the passing of Ezekiel. So we ordered an autopsy report because we wanted to find out what he'd actually died from. Because the doctor seemed confused about it. There was no solid answers. So we ordered the autopsy report, and it was upon receiving the autopsy report that I became suspicious that they were going to lay charges. And then sure enough, the next month, so we're talking February 2013, we get a phone call from the RCMP.
Once charges were laid, and by the time the actual court trial began, the Stephans were receiving nationwide media attention, even attracting international coverage because of the controversial nature of the case. At times, it pitted those favoring natural health approaches against those in favor of conventional medicine.
Do you remember the first report you saw there that got your attention, saying, hold on a second, that's not exactly how it happened?
I would never forget it.
Okay.
And the reason why is because of the amount of death threats that began flowing in immediately.
Death threats?
Death threats.
To you?
We've had over 300.
Oh my goodness.
So the substantial amount of death threats that began right away, that were coming in through social media, and I was seeing this, and what's going on, right? Like, there's all of a sudden this buzz. And so I went hunting, and sure enough, CBC, who hadn't been involved at all, they hadn't done any reporting with the preliminary trial or anything like that with us personally. They had just, they'd done a general report back in 2012 or 2013 when we were charged, but they weren't involved like CTV or Global or any of the other news outlets were. But they got involved the very first day of the trial, and they put out an article that was so misleading and so, as a general reader, you couldn't help but be absolutely filled with anger towards these parents based on the way that they wrote it. And I believe the headline was something like, parents attempt to treat dying toddler with bacterial meningitis with maple syrup, fruit, and juice, or something like that. Like, it was something so out there that made it look like we were just a bunch of crazies. And so people were angry.
Now, was the article, again, you feel it was leading people down a certain path, a certain flavor, if you will.
It looked like it had intent.
But was there inaccuracies in the report? For example, again, treating bacterial meningitis with maple syrup, you would disagree with that?
Well, we didn't treat anything with maple syrup. I mean, that wasn't a treatment. That I still don't know if it is a treatment for anything, right? Like, it
was simply designed to get fluid into your son.
Exactly. So that was completely misleading. And then fruit and juice, trying to treat him with fruit and juice, I don't even know where that came from. I guess if you were to break it right down, in one of the statements, the police statements, Colette talks about making smoothies from fruit and juice. But that wasn't a treatment.
Now, media also labeled you as being an anti-vaxxer. Where would you put yourself, I guess, on that whole issue? It's part of the conversation for sure. And there are other parents in Canada who are not in favor of vaccinations. That's hit the news a number of times over the last decades here. Would you label yourselves as anti-vaxxers?
I guess probably the best way to answer is, are we for vaccines? Absolutely not.
Okay.
Were we back then? No. Are we now? We're even more substantiated in our viewpoints on that.
Okay.
When we take a look at it and we see the damage that's reoccurring from these vaccines, when we take a look at the toxic elements in there, like the mercury or aluminum, and what that does on a neurological level, what it does in regard to brain damage and compromising people's cognitive function and all that, not for them. When we take a look at the lack of safety evidence that's coming out or that hasn't come out on the vaccines, we take issue with that as well.
So you're concerned about the safety and whether or not it's actually doing what it's supposed to do.
That's correct. And so as part of the reason why this came up in the court case, though, is the Crown was trying to use our court case as a precedent-setting case wherein parents could be held criminally liable if they didn't vaccinate their children.
So would you be of the opinion that the Crown and perhaps key leaders in Alberta Health Services really tried to make an example out of you through this case to send a message perhaps to any parents who don't follow the government-approved line, I guess, whether it comes to vaccinations or otherwise? They need to comply or else? Is that kind of the...
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying definitely that's where they're wanting to go, taking more away from parental rights.
Yeah, and even though they didn't follow through with it in court, once they saw our lineup of expert witnesses that we had on board to fight off the vaccine issue, so they completely shied away from it, and we didn't have to bring in those expert witnesses.
Well, that's interesting. So that didn't last very long in the courtroom then?
No, they
Okay.
ran away from it really quickly as soon as they saw that we actually had a defense.
One issue that came up in media coverage was the story of little Ezekiel suffering from symptoms of a back that was so stiff it prevented him from sitting in his car seat. He was instead laid up on a mattress during a trip to pick up naturopathic supplements from Lethbridge. The Crown's argument was that with these symptoms, any reasonable parent should have taken their child to see a doctor. We asked the Stephans to explain.
At that point, he's 18 months old, and we haven't yet transitioned him from the infant car seat over to the front-facing car seat, but he was at that point anyways. And on a good day, he didn't really like his car seat anyways, restrictive, and just being in the car seat. I know I wouldn't want to be in a car seat.
Yep.
And so anyways, I put him into it, and he didn't cry or anything like that. But when Colette looked at him, she just said, he looks really uncomfortable in that. And so that's why we opted, okay, well, based on the situation at hand, and that we need to get into signing these lawyers' papers, maybe we should just, err on the side of comfort here. And so we took his memory foam topper off of his mattress and just put that in the back of the vehicle so that he had mobility. And one of us just stayed back there with him, just making sure that he was sipping on his smoothie, that type of thing.
So to make it clear, from your perspective, you're saying you felt your son's symptoms were actually improving. They were not terrible, and his back was not arched to any kind of a point where this was, a meningitis sort of symptom. It was simply he was uncomfortable with this car seat. He was growing out of it, that sort of thing. What was the evidence that the Crown presented? Was there anything really specific to indicate that you did not provide the necessaries of life for your son Ezekiel?
No, what it was, and it was interesting, that the judge actually made mention of this at one point. He said this is a really peculiar case because these charges would typically be used for negligent parents, but all the evidence that's before the courts and the jury is that the Stephans are loving, caring, and attentive parents. And so he said this is really quite peculiar. So even he highlighted that point. So no, they never substantiated that we were negligent. What it came down to is that we didn't meet the criminal code standard or approved standard of care. And what that was in reference to was solely medical treatment, which is...
So not seeking medical treatment in a timely manner.
That's right.
Okay.
Which is peculiar because never once during the court case was it established that had we gone and seen a doctor that it would have actually even changed the outcome.
Now the Crown, I believe, was trying to prove that you as parents had made what they call a marked departure, I think that's the term they use, from the norm, that you had not responded to the health needs of your son as a reasonably minded parent would do. So that has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. So when Ezekiel got worse, you did call a registered nurse with 16 years experience in the emergency room to come check on your child, to take his vitals. I guess the question becomes, is that a marked departure from the norm? How would you see it?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, you know, the question was posed a few hours before Terry Manders got there. Do we take him to the doctor or do we not? And my response was, I don't believe so. I don't see anything there. And Colette thought, you know, I'm just going to take it to another level here. And so she decided, you know, well, I'm going to call Terry Manders and see what she has to say. I said, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, so because this is really the crux of the whole case here, is what you did or not did, you know, what is it a marked departure from what other reasonable parents would do?
After a contentious 2-week trial with conflicting evidence at times from medical experts and confusing instructions given to the jury by the trial judge, the Stephans were in fact convicted of not providing the necessaries of life for their son.
How was your response when you learned that you had lost the case and you are now guilty of not providing the necessaries of life for your son?
There was a lot of mixed emotions.
Yeah.
There was, you know, first of all, we learned that the media was reporting half an hour before the jury even came out with a verdict, that the media was reporting what the verdict was, that they were guilty. And then the jury comes and then they give it, but 6 out of 12 of them are crying. And you could see from the tears, you could see from their mannerisms that it was a decision that they didn't want to make. But based on the judge's charge to them, they were basically forced into a corner to have to make this decision. And it wasn't a quick decision that they made. It took over 24 hours for them to make it. And so, you know, we were just shaking our heads at the whole thing, saying, what happened here? What has taken place here? We knew that there was an issue with the charge to the jury, but we didn't think the jury would side with the judge on it and follow suit. So, but it was devastating because then we didn't know what was going to happen with our children. And Colette can speak a lot more to that about the stresses as a mother.
That would hit you like a train, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the judge sentenced you to, David, 4 months in jail, I believe, and I think it was 3 months of house arrest for yourself, Colette.
Yes.
And then the Crown appealed that. They wanted harsher sentences for both of you. Did either of you actually do jail time or house time in this process?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I did the 3 weeks, and he was in jail for 3 weeks.
For 3 weeks, okay.
Yeah,
and then community service as well, I think, on top of that, correct?
Yeah, we didn't do the community service. That was following the sentences being fulfilled, that then we'd have to do all that community service within 2 years. And but all of that was suspended or stayed with the bail conditions. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, being on appeal. And
Okay.
so did 3 weeks of jail time. And the reason for that difference in sentencing is they sentenced me to 4 months in jail because I was speaking out about the matter. Because I was speaking out about the hypocrisy of it all, saying, you've got an ambulance service that they were made aware of the fact that they didn't have the proper equipment. They were made aware of that for over a year previous to my son's death, and they didn't act on it, and so you've actually got a case of criminal negligence, which is a greater charge, and yet no investigation's taken place, no charges have been laid. Every child in that zone was in danger if they required an ambulance and needed an airway, and yet they weren't held accountable, and yet you're holding us accountable for a lesser charge, even though you've got criminal negligence that's abundantly clear over here. And so because I kept on speaking out about that,
So you
they
felt
dropped-
like a big boot was coming down on you from higher power, essentially, I suppose.
Well, how they categorized it was that I wasn't remorseful because I wouldn't shut up about it. Because there was such an injustice and I wasn't willing to let it slide. You know, you can't hold us accountable. Let's just say hypothetically that you know, we were guilty of everything that they charge us of. You still got a glaring case of where the paramedics were saying, you know, we need this equipment in the ambulance for over a year, and yet the Alberta Health Services wasn't meeting that demand in that zone, and yet other zones had that equipment. In fact, one of the paramedics was working 2 different zones. He said, you know, at one point he's working with ambulances that were properly equipped in one zone, but yet ill-equipped in another zone. And so you've got this situation taking place, and yet they're holding nobody accountable of it, and yet they're trying to throw us under the bus.
We've heard some very different narratives today. Media reports supporting the Crown's allegations of negligent parents and their parents sharing their side of the story. Is there a place to hold government departments liable if indeed proper equipment was not available and if ambulances were not dispatched properly? We will investigate this and more in Part 3 tomorrow.
Next time on Fighting for Ezekiel, did 911 dispatch the wrong ambulance?
But I do know we were there because the next morning after we heard about the incident, we said, I wonder what happened. We never got the call last night. We were all in town.
If they had received the call, would Ezekiel still be alive today? And was evidence withheld?
There was no logs of anything. There was no lab reports. We've asked for them repeatedly. We may have never even discovered that our son had gone for over 8 minutes without oxygen in the ambulance because it would have been like finding a needle in a haystack in the medical files that were supplied to us.
Did expert testimony line up with medical records?
A lab report that says there wasn't any bacteria. You've got a call made to them saying you need to find bacteria. And then you've got a revised report saying, okay, there was a little bit of bacteria. And then an email saying that they found it through a non-clinical test.
This and more in Part 3 of Fighting for Ezekiel.